Hello, and thank you for choosing this heartfelt, modest historical romance by C.E.Mallery. Before we get started, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support is appreciated and helps us continue bringing you more captivating tales, completely free. In each story are bits and pieces of true accounts of my personal life. So grab a pillow and make yourself at home and let your imagination transport you to a world of love, courage, and adventure in a time long past. Enjoy the story. Welcome to Whispers in the Wind. Chapter 1. The Arrival. The train screeched to a halt with a metallic groan, sending a shudder through the sun-baked platform of Willow Creek. A tall, slender Alice Ingle peeked out, her long blonde hair and her long, carefully tailored dress. She pressed her white-gloved hands together, trembling with anticipation and nerves in her long, delicate fingers as she stepped down from the intricately designed carriage. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush and hot iron, the kind of dry, wild fragrance that clung to the back of her throat and made her lips taste like dust. She wasn't used to the Oklahoma Territory dirt and heat, squinting and trying to focus. She paused, letting her eyes adjust to the harsh, golden light. The vast, endless sky stretched overhead, never-ending wide and blue, with only a few wisps of cloud drifting lazily above the endless prairie. The platform boards creaked beneath her carefully laced, freshly polished boots, each step echoing her uncertainty loud and clear. She could feel the heat prickling her skin right through the layers of her traveling dress, and she wondered if she would ever grow used to this relentless sun. A handful of townsfolk gathered and lingered nearby, their faces shaded by wide-brimmed hats and smiles of curiosity. Emily smelled the scent of leather and horses, mingled with the sharper tang of coal smoke from the departing train. She tried to stand tall, which wasn't hard to do. She looked every inch capable of a schoolteacher she had promised to be in her letters, but her heart pounded fiercely with a mix of fear and hope. Then she saw him. Sheriff Henry Taylor stood at the far end of the platform, his silhouette broad and unyielding against the glare. He wore a battered hat pulled low over his sunburned face. He felt the kind of determination that came from years of watching over a town like Willow Creek. His eyes, a piercing blue, found hers across the distance through the crowd, steady, assessing, and impossibly clear. Alice took a deep breath. There was something in his stare that felt like both a promise and a warning, as if he could see straight through her Boston manners and city nerves to the uncertainty beneath. She felt exposed, but also strangely safe, as if the Lord himself had sent her a guardian. He approached with long, measured strides, boots stirring up little puffs of dust that glimmered in the sunlight. Up close, she could see the lines etched deep around his eyes, the sunburned skin at his collar, the way his presence seemed to fill the space around him. He tipped his hat, his voice deep and rough as gravel. "Miss Ingle, I presume?" His words rumbled through her, feeling as though the earth beneath her feet trembled. She nodded slowly and carefully, her voice catching in her throat before she managed. "Yes, Sheriff Boone. Thank you for meeting me." He offered his arm, and she took it, feeling the strength in his grip and the warmth of his skin even through her gloves. Together, they walked down the bustling train station platform, past the curious stares and the scent of wild sage, toward the awaiting town. As they walked slowly, Alice was inquisitive and amazed at the scenery, tried to soak up the view and memorize everything. The way the sunlight shimmered on the dust, the distant whinny of horses, the taste of anticipation sharp in her mind. She could feel change in the air. She was a stranger here, but with every guided step she took, Willow Creek began to feel a little less foreign to her, and the look in Henry Taylor's eyes a little less intimidating. The breeze steadily became stronger, carrying with it what seemed to be whispers, faint whispers, almost like they were calling her name. Chapter 2. The Boarding House. The door to Mrs. Hargrove's boarding house swung open with a plaintive creak, the sound echoing through the dim, cool, never-ending hallway like a memory. Alice Ingle stepped inside, her senses immediately overwhelmed by the butter-enriched aroma of freshly baked bread, mingling with the faint, sweet scent of colorful wildflowers carefully arranged in a chipped porcelain vase on the entry table. There were pictures on the walls scattered throughout the house of guests who have previously stayed there. The air was thick and warm, heavy with the promise of comfort but carried the weight of unspoken stories. The floorboards beneath Alice's boots groaned in protest, each step a reminder of the house's age and the many lives that had passed through its rooms. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, painting delicate patterns on the faded wallpaper and illuminating motes of dust that danced lazily in the golden glow. The parlor, just off the entryway, was dim but inviting. As Alice stepped inside, her eyes scanned the room carefully. The mismatched armchairs worn soft by years of use, their upholstery faded but clean. The decorations on the fireplace were old and outdated. Even the throw rug under the coffee table had seen its better days, she thought. The air in the room felt dense, almost tangible, as if it held the secrets and longings of every soul who had ever sought refuge within these walls. Mrs. Hargrove herself bustled in from the kitchen, her ample figure wrapped in a faded blue apron, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the oven. Her hands, dusted with flour, were strong and capable, yet her touch was gentle as she wiped them on her apron and reached out to greet Alice with a great big smile. Her eyes, gentle but assessing, softened as she took in Alice's nervous smile and travel-worn dress. "Well, you must be Miss Ingle," she said, her voice brisk but kind, like a busy woman who wore many hats. Come in, you poor thing. Look at you. You look half-starved and twice as tired. Let's get you settled before you fall over." Alice felt a rush of gratitude and embarrassment, her cheeks warming as she followed Mrs. Hargrove down the narrow hallway. The walls were lined with faded photographs, stern-faced men in Sunday suits, women in high-necked dresses, children with solemn eyes. Each face seemed to watch her, their silent scrutiny both welcoming and intimidating. In the dining room, the long wooden table was set for supper, the heavy crockery gleaming in the lamplight. The smell of fresh bread was stronger in here, mingling with the savory aroma of a stew simmering on the stove. Alice's stomach rumbled, and she realized just how hungry she was. It was a long ride and the taste of dust and travel still lingering on her tongue. The other boarders began to drift in, drawn by the promise of food and company. First came Mr. Tully, a weathered ranch hand with sun-browned skin and hands as rough as saddle leather. He nodded politely. "Howdy, Mom?" His eyes kind but wary, as if he measured every newcomer against some private standard. Next was Mrs. Finch, the widowed seamstress, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, her dress neat but old and thin. She offered Alice a small, sad smile, her eyes shadowed with loss but bright with curiosity. Last was little Samuel, a shy boy of perhaps 8 or 9, his hair a tousled mess of curls, his eyes wide and watchful. He clung to Mrs. Finch's skirt, peeking out at Alice with a mixture of fear and fascination. He never seen such a fancy lady before. Alice's heart ached for him, remembering her own childhood fears and the comfort of a mother's hand. As they gathered around the table, Mrs. Hargrove sliced the bread, the crust crackling under her knife. She passed thick, steaming slices to each boarder, the bread still warm from the oven, its yeasty scent filling the room. Alice spread a pat of fresh butter on her slice, watching it melt into golden pools. Oh, yum. The first bite was heavenly, soft, warm, and rich, the taste of home she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Conversation flowed in fits and starts, punctuated by the clink of spoons and the low murmur of voices. Alice felt the weight of curious eyes on her, the boarders' questions gentle but probing. Where was she from? Why had she come so far? Did she have family? Each answer she gave felt like a thread, weaving her into the fabric of the house, even as she sensed the boundaries of privacy and pain that each person guarded. The parlor after supper was a world of shadows and soft lamplight. The air was thick with the scent of bread and the faint, lingering aroma of lavender from Mrs. Hargrove's sachets she placed around the house. Alice settled into a worn armchair, the upholstery scratchy against her palms, and listened to the quiet hum of the house, the distant clatter of dishes, the low murmur of Mrs. Finch's lullaby to Samuel, the creak of Mr. Tully's boots as he paced the porch. She felt both welcomed and scrutinized, comforted and alone. The house wrapped around her like a patchwork quilt, warm, familiar, but stitched with secrets and longing. As she closed her eyes, the taste of bread and butter still on her tongue, Alice wondered what stories these walls would tell her, and what place she might find among these strangers in the wild, whispering heart of Willow Creek. Chapter 3. The Schoolhouse. The morning sun spilled across the prairie in golden waves, painting the whitewashed walls of Willow Creek's one-room schoolhouse with a soft, hopeful glow. Alice Ingle stood at the threshold, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird in her chest. The air was alive with the scent of wildflowers, sweet and grassy, drifting in through the open windows, mingled with the sharper tang of chalk dust and the faint, comforting aroma of old wood warmed by sunlight. She paused, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands, feeling the rough weave of the fabric beneath her fingertips. Her palms were damp, her breath shallow, but she straightened her shoulders and stepped inside, determined to meet this new day with courage. The schoolhouse was simple but sturdy, its walls scrubbed clean, the floor swept and shining. Sunbeams slanted through the windows, catching in the motes of dust that danced lazily in the air. Rows of wooden desks, scarred by years of restless hands and carved initials, filled the room. Alice ran her fingers along the edge of the teacher's desk, feeling the deep grooves and splinters, a tactile reminder of all the lives that had passed through this place before her. The children tumbled in, a noisy, chaotic wave of energy and color. Their cheeks were sunburned and freckled, their hair tousled by the wind, their clothes patched and faded but clean. Some wore boots too big for their feet, others went barefoot, their toes dusty and calloused. Their laughter rang out, bright and unrestrained, echoing off the high ceiling and filling the room with a sense of wild possibility. So unlike the prim and proper children back home, she thought. Alice watched them with a mixture of awe and trepidation. There was Tommy, the ringleader, his grin wide and mischievous, a shock of red hair sticking up in every direction. He jostled his friends, daring them to race to their seats. "Bet I can get to the back before you, Billy," Tommy shouted, darting past a smaller boy. Billy, not to be outdone, stuck out his tongue and chased after him, their boots thudding against the floorboards. Beside them, little Mary clutched a battered slate to her chest, her eyes wide and solemn, her braids tied with faded blue ribbons. She hovered near the front, glancing shyly at Alice, then quickly away. In the back, Samuel, quiet, watchful, sat alone, his gaze fixed on the window, as if longing for something just out of reach. Alice cleared her throat, the sound barely audible above the din. She tried again, her voice trembling but determined. "Good morning, everyone. My name is Miss Ingle. I'll be your new teacher." The room stilled, dozens of eyes turning to her, curious, skeptical, hopeful. She felt the weight of their attention, the silent challenge in their stares. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to smile, to project warmth and confidence she wasn't sure she possessed. Tommy was the first to break the silence. "You talk funny, Miss Ingle. Are you from the city?" A ripple of giggles ran through the room. Alice smiled, letting the laughter settle her nerves. "I am from Boston, Tommy, and I suppose I do sound a bit different. But I'm here to learn about Willow Creek, just as much as you're here to learn from me." Mary raised her hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will you read to us, Miss Ingle? Mrs. Carter used to read stories after lunch." Alice's heart softened. "Of course, Mary. I brought a book of fairy tales with me. We'll read together every day if you'd like." A few of the older boys exchanged skeptical glances, but even they seemed intrigued. Alice moved among the desks, her footsteps muffled by the worn floorboards. The children's faces were a study in contrasts, some open and eager, others guarded, their bravado masking a deeper loneliness. She saw it in the way they glanced at each other, in the quick, nervous laughter that faded too quickly, in the way Samuel shrank into himself when Tommy's jokes grew too loud. She knelt beside Samuel's desk, her voice gentle. "What's your favorite subject, Samuel?" He shrugged, not meeting her eyes. "Don't know. Maybe drawing." Alice smiled, pulling a small box of colored chalk from her satchel. "I'd love to see your drawings. Maybe you can help me decorate the blackboard?" Samuel's eyes flickered with interest, and for a moment the shadow of a smile crossed his lips. Alice's hands shook as she picked up a piece of chalk, the cool, powdery stick leaving a faint residue on her skin. She wrote her name on the blackboard, the letters looping and elegant, her script a small act of defiance against her nerves. The chalk squeaked, the sound sharp and startling in the quiet. She turned to face her students, her back straight, her chin lifted. "I know I'm new here," she said, her voice steadier now. "But I want you to know that this is our school, a place for learning, for laughter, for kindness. I hope we can make it a home for all of us." A hush fell over the room, the children watching her with something like respect. Alice felt a surge of hope, fragile but real, blooming in her chest. She smiled, and this time, it felt genuine. As the lesson began, the schoolhouse filled with the sounds of recitation and laughter, the scratch of slate pencils, the rustle of pages. The sunlight warmed Alice's shoulders, the scent of wildflowers and chalk swirling around her like a promise. The wooden desk was rough beneath her fingers, grounding her in this new reality. During arithmetic, Tommy tried to sneak a frog from his pocket, but Alice caught him with a raised eyebrow. "Mr. Tommy, I do hope that frog is here to learn his numbers, too." The class erupted in laughter, and even Tommy grinned, tucking the frog away. Alice felt herself relax, the children's acceptance slowly weaving her into the fabric of their world. Yet beneath the surface, Alice sensed the undercurrents of loneliness and longing that ran through her students, the ache of absent fathers, the fear of change, the hope for something better. She vowed in that moment to be more than just a teacher. She would be a safe harbor, a guiding hand, a source of light in their sometimes shadowed world. And as the prairie wind whispered through the open windows, Alice felt, for the first time, that she truly belonged. Chapter 4. The Saloon, the Silver Spur. Saloon was a world apart from the sunlit innocence of the schoolhouse. Its swinging doors groaned on their hinges as Alice stepped inside, the heavy, humid air closing around her like a velvet curtain. The room was alive with the clamor of piano music, jaunty, slightly off-key, but full of reckless joy. Laughter rolled through the haze, mingling with the sharp, almost medicinal tang of whiskey and the acrid bite of cigar smoke that curled in lazy spirals toward the battered tin ceiling. Alice paused just inside the threshold, her heart thudding in her chest. She felt the weight of a dozen eyes, some curious, some suspicious, all assessing, slide over her prim, high-collared dress and tightly pinned hair. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, a hot flush that crept up her neck and made her wish she could melt into the floorboards. She clutched her purse with white-knuckled fingers, acutely aware of how out of place she was in this den of revelry and rough laughter. She wondered, not for the first time, why Willow Creek didn't have a proper restaurant or tea room, somewhere a lady could get a decent drink without risking her reputation. The Lord certainly didn't approve of such places, she thought, her conscience prickling with guilt. She didn't drink spirits, never had, never would, and the very idea of being seen in a saloon made her stomach twist with anxiety. Yet here she was, driven by thirst and curiosity and perhaps a stubborn streak she hadn't known she possessed. The bartender, a burly man with a bristling mustache and a voice like gravel, eyed her with a mixture of suspicion and amusement. "What'll it be, miss?" he rumbled, wiping a glass with a rag that had seen better days. Alice cleared her throat, her voice barely audible above the din. "Lemonade, please, if you have it." A few patrons snickered, but the bartender only grunted and poured her a glass from a chipped pitcher. The lemonade was tart and bracing, the cold glass sweating in her hand, droplets running down her wrist and soaking into her glove. She took a cautious sip, the sharp citrus bite waking her senses and grounding her in the moment. She perched on the edge of a bar stool, her back ramrod straight, trying to make herself as small and inconspicuous as possible. The patrons around her were a rough-hewn lot, ranch hands with sunburned faces and calloused hands, gamblers in threadbare waistcoats, a pair of painted ladies with laughter as bright and brittle as broken glass. Their voices rose and fell in a symphony of boldness and longing, the air thick with stories and secrets. Henry Taylor stood near the far wall, his broad shoulders tense beneath his worn shirt, his face set in a line of quiet authority. His eyes, dark, steady, always searching, swept the room, missing nothing. He was a sentinel, a silent guardian, and Alice felt both comforted and challenged by his nearness. There was something in the way he watched her, a mixture of protectiveness and gentle amusement, as if he saw straight through her prim exterior to the uncertainty beneath. She tried to hide the way her heart fluttered whenever his gaze lingered on her, the way his presence seemed to fill the room and make the shadows recede. She shouldn't be here, she reminded herself. She didn't belong in a place like this, surrounded by smoke and laughter and the clink of whiskey glasses. The Lord didn't approve of such revelings, and neither did she. Yet, as she sipped her lemonade as quickly as possible while listening to the conversations around her, she couldn't help but feel like she just did in the schoolhouse, only with grown-ups. What kind of lives did these people really live, she wondered. The air was thick with anticipation, every moment charged with the possibility of trouble or delight. Alice's cheeks still burned, her hands still trembled, but as Henry's eyes met hers across the crowded room, she felt a strange, exhilarating sense of belonging. For the first time, she wondered what Willow Creek was all about. Chapter 5. The Storm. The prairie sky had been restless all afternoon, clouds gathering in bruised, purple heaps on the horizon, and everyone knew what that meant for an Oklahoma sky. Alice watched from the schoolhouse window as the wind picked up, bending the wild grasses and sending dust swirling in frantic swirls across the yard. The air felt heavy. It felt like rain, but something more, something wild and unpredictable. She was gathering her books, the last of the children had already gone, when the first fat drops began to spatter against the glass. Within moments, the sky split wide open. Rain hammered the tin roof in a deafening roar, drowning out every other sound. Lightning forked across the prairie, illuminating the world in stark silver flashes. Deafening thunder followed, a deep, rolling growl that seemed to shake the very bones of the little schoolhouse. Alice could feel her heart beat. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, trying to steady her breath. Thunderstorms had always unsettled her, ever since she was a child in Boston, huddled beneath her mother's quilt, counting the seconds between flash and boom. Out here, with nothing but open land and sky, the storm felt even more immense, untamable, almost alive with a vengeance. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. She turned, heart pounding faster than ever. As the door swung open and the brave Henry Taylor stepped inside, rainwater streaming from the brim of his hat and soaking his shirt. He looked like he'd been carved from the storm itself. His face was filled with compassion and determination. Tall, broad-shouldered, fearless, and soaking wet. "Miss Ingle," he said, his voice low and calm. "I saw the storm coming. Figured you might need some company." Alice tried to smile. "Are you coming to check up on me, Mr. Taylor?" I was just about to leave, but..." She glanced at the sheets of rain lashing against the windows, the world outside reduced to a blur of gray and silver. "I suppose I'm not going anywhere for a while." Henry set his hat on a peg and crossed the room, his boots leaving wet prints on the floor. He moved with a kind of deliberate gentleness, as if he knew how easily the storm could rattle a person's nerves. He took a seat on the bench near the stove, his hands folded loosely in his lap. "Storms blow through quick out here," he said, his voice a soothing rumble. "It's best just to wait 'em out." Alice nodded, hugging her arms around herself. The scent of wet dirt drifted in through the cracks in the windows. It was sharp, mingling with the lingering aroma of chalk and old wood. The air inside the schoolhouse felt charged, every breath tingling with electricity. Alice suddenly could feel the hair on the back of her neck stand up. A flash of lightning lit the room, followed by a thunderclap so loud it rattled the windows. Alice flinched, her eyes squeezing shut, shaking her head and almost hyperventilating. She felt foolish, a grown woman still afraid of storms, but she couldn't help it. Henry came closer. "Are you all right?" he said in a low, calm voice. She opened her eyes, forcing a shaky laugh. "I've never much liked thunder. It always feels like the world is coming apart at the seams." He smiled, the lines around his eyes softening. "You're not alone in that. My ma used to say thunder was just the angels bowling up in heaven. I never quite believed her, but it helped when I was a boy." Alice managed a real smile, the tension in her shoulders easing. "My mother used to tell me stories too. She'd sit with me until the storm passed, reading by candlelight. I suppose I miss that most of all, someone to sit with, to make the fear seem smaller." Henry nodded, his stare caring and kind. Sometimes all a person needs is someone to ride out the storm with. For a while they sat in companionable silence, the rain drumming a steady rhythm on the roof. Alice found herself watching Henry, the way the lamplight caught in his hair, the quiet strength in his words. She felt the air between them shift, charged not just with the storm, but with words unspoken, questions and hopes neither dared voice. Another flash of lightning, another crash of thunder. This time Alice didn't flinch. She drew a slow breath, letting the scent of rain and earth fill her lungs. The fear was still there, but it was softer now, dulled by Henry's presence. She glanced at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for checking up on me." He looked at her, something warm and unguarded in his eyes. "Anytime, Miss Ingle. You're not alone out here. Not anymore." The storm raged on, but inside the schoolhouse the world felt smaller, safer. Alice let herself lean into the moment, the sound of rain and Henry's considerate presence wrapping around her like that blanket used to. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, she felt the many possibilities of finding shelter, not just from the storm, but from the loneliness that had followed her across the prairie. And as the thunder rolled away into the distance, Alice realized she was no longer afraid. Chapter 6. The Annual Festival. The night of the Willow Creek Annual Festival arrived with a sense of anticipation that seemed to shimmer in the very air. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when the townsfolk began to gather at the old Miller barn, its wide doors thrown open to the prairie breeze. Lanterns hung from every rafter and fence post, their golden light flickering and swaying, casting playful shadows across the packed earth and the faces of neighbors and friends. Alice stood just outside the barn, her hair loose for the first time since she'd arrived in Willow Creek, the soft waves tumbling over her shoulders. She wore a simple blue dress, the fabric light and airy, and for once she felt unburdened by the expectations of Boston or the weight of her own worries. The air was cool and sweet, tinged with the scent of hay and wildflowers, and every breath she took seemed to fill her with a new, giddy energy. Inside, the festival was already in full swing. Children darted between the adults, their laughter ringing out as they chased each other around the hay bales. Tables groaned under the weight of pies, roasted meats, and fresh bread, the aromas mingling in a way that made Alice's mouth water. Fiddle music soared above the chatter, the notes bright and wild, swirling through the barn like a living thing. She watched as couples spun across the makeshift dance floor, boots thumping in time to the music, skirts twirling in a blur of color. For a moment, Alice hesitated at the threshold, her heart fluttering with nerves and excitement. She had never been to a barn dance before, never felt so much a part of something so joyful and alive. Then Henry appeared at her side, his presence as steady and reassuring as ever. He wore a clean white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, and his hair was neatly combed, though a stubborn lock still fell across his brow. He smiled at her, a slow, genuine smile that made her cheeks flush. "Evening, Miss Ingle," he said, his voice warm and a little shy. "Would you do me the honor of a dance?" Alice laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her. "I'm afraid I might step on your toes, Mr. Taylor. I've never danced in a barn before. Henry offered his hand, his touch gentle but firm. Don't worry, I'll lead. She placed her hand in his, surprised by the strength and warmth of his grip. He guided her onto the dance floor just as the fiddler struck up a waltz, the melody sweet and lilting. Henry's other hand settled lightly at her waist, and for a moment Alice forgot everything but the music and the man before her. They began to move, slowly at first, then with growing confidence as Henry guided her through the steps. The hay beneath their feet was soft and fragrant, the cool night air brushing against Alice's flushed cheeks. She felt weightless, her feet barely touching the ground as they spun beneath the lanterns, the world narrowing to the circle of Henry's arms and the music that seemed to pulse in her very bones. "You're a natural," Henry murmured, his eyes never leaving hers. Alice laughed again, breathless. "You're a very patient teacher." He grinned, his gaze softening. "I reckon I could get used to this." As the waltz carried them around the barn, Alice felt her heart race, not with fear or uncertainty, but with a wild, exhilarating joy. She let herself lean into the moment, her laughter mingling with the music, her worries forgotten. The scent of hay and lantern oil, the coolness of the night, the warmth of Henry's hand, all of it wove together into something magical and unforgettable. When the music slowed, Henry drew her a little closer, his voice low and earnest. "I'm glad you're here, Alice. Willow Creek's a better place with you in it." She looked up at him, her heart full. "I'm glad I'm here too, Henry. I never thought I'd find a home so far from where I started." For a moment, the world seemed to pause, the lanterns swaying, the music fading, the laughter and chatter receding into the background. All that remained was the two of them, standing together in the golden glow, the promise of something new and wonderful blooming between them. As the next song began and Henry swept her into another dance, Alice knew she would remember this night for the rest of her life, the night she truly belonged, the night her heart learned to waltz. Chapter 7. The Rival. The bell above the door of Willow Creek's general store jingled as Alice stepped inside, the familiar sound swallowed by the low hum of voices and the shuffle of boots on worn wooden planks. The store was crowded this morning, the air thick with the scent of coffee grounds, licorice, and the faint metallic tang of penny nails. Sunlight slanted through the dusty windows, catching on glass jars filled with lemon drops and peppermint sticks, and on bolts of calico stacked in neat, colorful rows along the back wall. Alice paused just inside the door, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. The store was a patchwork of color and sound, children's laughter as they pressed their noses to the candy jars, the sharp snap of fabric as Mrs. Hargrove examined a bolt of blue gingham, the low, conspiratorial murmur of women trading news over the pickle barrel. Every corner seemed to hold a secret, every face a story. She made her way toward the counter, her basket swinging lightly at her side. She needed flour, a spool of thread, and perhaps a treat for Samuel, who had been especially brave during spelling lessons that week. As she reached for a tin of tea, a voice, smooth as river stones, edged with something sharper, broke through the din. "Well, if it isn't Miss Ingle, I was beginning to think you'd gone and hidden yourself away from the rest of us." Alice turned, her heart giving a small, startled leap. Lucas Grady stood before her, his dark hair perfectly in place, his eyes a shade too bright, his smile a little too practiced. He wore a crisp white shirt beneath a tailored vest, the faintest trace of cologne, spicy, almost citrus, clinging to him. He looked every inch the successful rancher, but there was something in the set of his jaw, the glint in his eyes, that made Alice's skin prickle with unease. She forced a polite smile, careful to keep her voice steady. "Good morning, Mr. Grady. I hope you're well?" Lucas leaned in, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I'm always well when I get to see a pretty face in town. Makes the day go by a little sweeter." His words were honeyed, but Alice caught the edge beneath them, the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long. She stepped back, her fingers tightening around the handle of her basket. The store felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier, as if every whisper and sideways glance was aimed at her. "I'm just here for a few things," she said, her tone cool but not unkind. "The children have been asking for lemon drops." Lucas's smile widened, but his eyes narrowed, calculating. "You're making quite an impression, you know. Folks are talking. Some say you're just what this town needed. Others, well, they wonder if you're too good for us." Alice felt a flush rise in her cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and irritation. She glanced around, noticing the way Mrs. Hargrove's conversation had paused, the way Mr. Tully's eyes flicked in their direction. The store was alive with gossip, every word and gesture feeding the hungry curiosity of a small town. "I'm just doing my best," Alice replied, her voice soft but firm. "Willow Creek has been very welcoming." Lucas's cologne seemed to grow stronger, almost cloying. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Be careful, Miss Ingle. Not everyone here is as friendly as they seem. Some folks don't take kindly to outsiders, especially ones who turn heads." Alice met his gaze, searching for the truth behind his words. Was it a warning or a threat? She couldn't tell. She felt torn between the need to be polite and the urge to step away, to put distance between herself and this man who seemed to know too much and say too little. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Grady," she said, her tone clipped. "But I can take care of myself." Lucas's smile faltered for just a heartbeat, then returned, brighter and more brittle than before. "I'm sure you can, but if you ever need a friend or a favor, you know where to find me." He tipped his hat and melted back into the crowd, leaving behind a swirl of cologne and unease. Alice let out a slow breath, her heart pounding. She turned back to the counter, her hands trembling as she counted out coins for her purchases. As she left the store, the bell jingling behind her, Alice felt the weight of every eye in the room. The taste of lemon drops lingered on her tongue, sharp and sweet. But the memory of Lucas Grady's words left a bitter aftertaste. She stepped into the sunlight, the cool breeze a balm against her flushed skin, and promised herself she would not be intimidated. Not by gossip, not by sly smiles, not by the secrets that seemed to swirl just beneath the surface of Willow Creek. But as she walked home, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that the festival's magic had faded, replaced by something darker and more uncertain. And somewhere, in the shadows of the general store, she knew a new story was beginning, one that would test her courage, her kindness, and her heart. Chapter 8. The Secret. The prairie at night was a world transformed. Gone was the golden heat of day, replaced by a silvery hush that seemed to stretch on forever. The moon hung low and full, casting a pale glow over the endless sea of grass, each blade shimmering with dew. The wind moved softly, whispering secrets through the wild sage and sending ripples across the land like a gentle hand smoothing a quilt. Alice walked slowly, her shoes forgotten in the cool grass, the earth damp and alive beneath her bare feet. The air was crisp, tinged with the sharp green scent of sage and the faint sweetness of distant wildflowers. Every breath she drew felt new, as if she were inhaling the very heart of the prairie. Henry walked beside her, his silhouette tall and steady against the moonlit horizon. He was quiet, his hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the stars that blazed overhead. So many, so bright, it seemed impossible that the sky could hold them all. The silence between them was comfortable but charged, as if the night itself was waiting for something to be spoken. They stopped at the crest of a small rise, the grass swaying around them, shadows deep and mysterious at their feet. Alice wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the coolness of the night seep into her skin, mingling with the warmth that Henry's nearness always seemed to bring. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the wind and the distant call of a night bird, the world holding its breath. Finally, Alice broke the silence, her voice soft and uncertain. "I used to be afraid of the dark. Back in Boston, I'd lie awake at night, listening to the city and wishing I could see the stars. Here it's different. The darkness feels honest. like it's hiding things, but not from me. From itself. Henry glanced at her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight, gentle and searching. The prairie's got a way of making a person feel small. But it's honest, like you said. Out here, you can't hide from yourself. Alice hesitated, her heart pounding. She looked up at the sky, searching for courage in the constellations. I haven't told anyone this. Not really. I came here because I was running away. My father, he wanted me to marry a man I didn't love. Someone with money, a name. I couldn't do it. I couldn't live a life that wasn't mine. Her words hung in the air, bittersweet and trembling. She felt the sting of old shame, the ache of loneliness that had followed her across miles and months. Sometimes I wonder if I was selfish, if I hurt them by leaving. Henry was silent for a long time, the wind tugging at his hair, the scent of sage swirling around them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough with feeling. You did what you had to do. Takes courage to walk away from what's expected, more than most folks have. Alice looked at him, searching his face for judgment, but found only understanding. What about you, Henry? What brought you here? He looked away, shaking his head, the shadows deepening around his eyes. I've got my own ghosts, things I ain't proud of. I came out here to start over, same as you. Figured if I kept moving, maybe they wouldn't catch up. The confession was quiet, but it carried the weight of years. Alice reached out, her hand finding his in the darkness. His fingers were rough, warm, trembling just a little as he closed them around hers. They stood together, the prairie stretching out in every direction, the sky ablaze with stars. The night air was cool, the scent of wild sage strong and grounding. Alice felt the ache in her chest ease, replaced by something softer, more hopeful. She squeezed Henry's hand, her voice barely more than a whisper. Maybe we can help each other. Maybe we don't have to run anymore. Henry looked at her, his eyes shining. Maybe we don't. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The wind, the stars, even the secrets they carried. In the hush of the moonlit prairie, Alice felt the possibility of forgiveness, of belonging, of love. The night was still deep and mysterious, but it no longer felt lonely. Together, they stood beneath the endless sky, sharing the weight of their secrets, and letting the prairie wind carry them away. Chapter 9. The Threat. The edge of Willow Creek was a place where the prairie met the town in a blur of dust and sunlight, the land stretching wide and empty beyond the last weathered fence post. It was here, beneath a sky bleached pale by the afternoon sun, that Alice found herself caught in a storm of tempers and old grudges. The air was thick with heat and tension, the kind that made sweat bead on the back of her neck and turned every breath into a shallow gasp. Dust swirled around her boots, stinging her eyes and coating her tongue with a bitter, metallic taste. The sun pressed down, harsh and unrelenting, burning her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. Henry stood at her side, his body tense, every muscle coiled and ready. His hand hovered near his holster, fingers flexing with the promise of action. His eyes, usually so gentle, were hard now, narrowed and watchful, fixed on the man who stood a few paces away. Lucas Grady looked every inch the villain in that moment. His dark hair was slicked back, his shirt immaculate despite the dust, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He wore a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, which were cold and flat as river stones. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, the picture of easy confidence, but there was a tension in his jaw, a flicker of something dangerous beneath the surface. Alice's heart hammered in her chest, each beat loud and frantic. She could taste fear, sharp, metallic like blood in her mouth. She wanted to run, to hide, but she stood her ground, her hands clenched at her sides, her voice trembling but determined. "Lucas, this isn't necessary," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Whatever you think you're proving, it won't change anything." Lucas's smirk widened, but his eyes never left Henry. "You sure about that, Miss Ingle? Seems to me a lot's changed since you came to town. Folks are talking. Some of us don't like outsiders stirring up trouble. Henry's voice was low, steady, but there was steel in it. If you've got a problem, Grady, you take it up with me. Leave Alice out of it. Lucas laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. Always the hero, aren't you, Taylor? But you can't protect her from everything. Sooner or later she'll see what this town is really like. The words hung in the air, heavy as thunder. Alice felt the weight of every eye in town, every whisper and rumor pressing in on her. She swallowed hard, the taste of fear thick in her throat, but she refused to look away. "I'm not afraid of you, Lucas," she said, her voice steadier now. "And I'm not leaving." Lucas's eyes flickered just for a moment, with something like surprise. Then the coldness returned and he spat in the dust at her feet. "You should be." Henry stepped forward, his shadow falling across the ground between them. "That's enough. You've said your piece. Now get out of here before you say something you'll regret." For a moment, it seemed Lucas might push back, might let the tension snap into violence. The air was electric, charged with the possibility of disaster. Alice could feel her pulse in her fingertips, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. But then Lucas stepped back, his smirk fading into something darker. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and venomous. "Not by a long shot." He turned on his heel and strode away, dust rising in his wake, the sun glinting off the silver buckle at his waist. Alice watched him go, her knees weak, her whole body trembling with adrenaline and relief. Henry turned to her, his hand still hovering near his holster, his eyes softening as he took in her fear. "Are you all right?" Alice nodded, though her voice was barely a whisper. "I think so. Thank you, Henry." He reached out, his hand warm and steady on her shoulder. "You're safe now. I promise." The words settled over her like a balm, easing the ache in her chest. The sun was still harsh, the dust still swirling, but for the first time, Alice felt something stronger than fear, a fierce, unyielding resolve. She would not be driven away. She would not let Lucas Grady or anyone else decide her fate. As Henry led her back toward town, Alice glanced over her shoulder at the empty road, the prairie stretching out beyond. The threat still lingered, a shadow on the horizon, but she walked on, her head held high, her heart unbroken. Chapter 10. The Betrayal. The schoolhouse was a lonely silhouette against the night, its whitewashed walls bathed in the cold blue of moonlight. Shadows stretched long and thin across the yard, and the prairie wind carried a chill that seemed to seep into Alice's bones as she approached. She clutched her light blue shawl tighter, the one her mother gave to her. Her footsteps muffled by the soft earth, her heart heavy with a dread she couldn't name. She saw the damage before she reached the door, a window shattered. Jagged shards glinting on the windowsill and scattered across the dark ground like cruel little stars. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges as the wind pushed it back and forth. Alice's breath caught in her throat, the metallic tang of fear sharp on her tongue. Inside, the schoolhouse was a chaos of overturned desks and spilled ink, all her items in disarray. The air thick with the scent of broken glass and something darker. Betrayal, sharp and bitter. The lamp she'd left on her desk flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows that danced across the walls. Her books she brought with her lay strewn across the floor, pages torn and trampled, the blackboard smeared with angry, childish scribblings. Alice's long-fingered hands shook as she balled them into fists. She stepped inside, her shoes crunching on glass. Tears stung her eyes, hot and blinding, as she took in the destruction. This place had been her sanctuary, her hope, a place she ran to for comfort, and now it was violated. Her trust shattered as surely as the window. A sob escaped her lips, raw and helpless. She knelt beside her desk, gathering the ruined papers, her fingers stained with ink. The betrayal was a living thing, coiling in her chest, squeezing until she could barely breathe. She thought of the children, of the laughter, and learning that had filled these walls, and wondered who could have done this, who she had let close enough to hurt her so deeply. The door banged open and Henry burst in, his face flushed with anger, his eyes wild with worry. He took in the scene in a single, searing glance. He took a deep breath with anger on his face. "Alice, are you hurt?" His voice was rough and desperate. Shaking her head, her mouth open but unable to speak, her tears falling faster now. Henry crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly over her shoulders. "Who did this?" he demanded, his voice trembling with fury. "Tell me, Alice. I'll make them pay." Alice looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears. "I don't know. I trusted them, Henry. I trusted them, and they did this." Her voice broke, the words torn from her like a fresh scab on a wound. Henry's face twisted with guilt, gritting his teeth. "I should have been here. I should have protected you, protected this place. I'm so sorry, Alice. I never wanted—" He broke off, his own voice thick with emotion. She shook her head, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. "It's not your fault. I thought I knew them. I thought I was making a difference." Henry reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. "You are making a difference here. Don't let this take that from you. Don't let them win." Alice squeezed his hand, her fingers trembling. The room was silent except for the soft drip of ink from the desk, the wind sighing through the broken window. The taste of betrayal lingered, bitter and unyielding, but beneath it was something else, a fierce, stubborn hope. She looked around at the wreckage and thought deeply for a moment, her heart aching. She refused to let this break her. "We'll fix it," she whispered, more to herself than to Henry. "We'll put it all back together." Henry nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'll help you, I promise." Together they began to pick up the pieces, their hands moving side by side in the flickering lamplight. The night was still deep and full of shadows, but Alice felt a spark of resolve kindle in her chest. She would not let betrayal stop her. Pulling herself up by her own heel straps, she would rebuild stronger than before, and she would not do it alone. As the prairie wind swept through the broken window, carrying away the scent of spilled ink and sorrow, Alice knew that trust could be shattered, but it could also be mended, piece by piece, in the hands of those who truly cared. Chapter 11. The reckoning dawn crept over the prairie in a hush of pale gold and lavender, the first rays of sunlight glinting off the dew-soaked grass. The air was crisp, sharp with the promise of a new day, but the outskirts of Willow Creek felt heavy with unfinished business. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break. Alice knelt in the tall grass, her skirts damp and clinging to her knees, the ground cold and unforgiving beneath her. Her hands were clasped tight, knuckles white, as she watched the 2 men she cared about most face each other in the growing light. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat a prayer, each breath a silent plea. Henry stood tall, his silhouette outlined by the rising sun, his face set in grim determination. His hand hovered near his holster, fingers steady, eyes locked on Lucas Grady. The tension in his body was palpable, every muscle coiled and ready, his jaw clenched with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Lucas stood opposite, his dark hair tousled, his shirt rumpled from a sleepless night. There was a wildness in his eyes, a desperate edge that made Alice's blood run cold. He sneered, but the bravado was thin, stretched tight over fear and fury. His hand hovered near his own gun, the morning light glinting off the polished metal. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant call of a meadowlark and the soft rustle of wind through the grass. Alice's breath caught in her throat as Henry spoke, his voice low and even. "It doesn't have to end this way, Lucas. You can walk away. No one else has to get hurt." Lucas spat in the dirt, his voice raw. "You think you're better than me, Taylor? You think you can take everything I've worked for and just walk away clean?" Henry shook his head, sorrow flickering in his eyes. "I never wanted this. But I won't let you hurt Alice. Or anyone else." Lucas's hand twitched, his eyes darting to Alice, who met his gaze with all the courage she could muster. You should have stayed out of it, Miss Ingle. This was never your fight. Alice's voice trembled, but she forced herself to speak. It became my fight when you tried to destroy everything I love. Please, Lucas, don't do this. For a heartbeat, something human flickered in Lucas's eyes. Regret, maybe, or the memory of a better man. But then the moment passed, and his hand flashed to his gun. The world exploded in sound. The crack of gunfire shattered the dawn, echoing across the empty fields. Alice screamed, her hands flying to her mouth as she watched the scene unfold in slow motion. Henry's shot rang true. Lucas staggered, his gun falling from his hand as he clutched his side, crimson blooming across his shirt. He dropped to his knees, the fight draining from his eyes, replaced by shock and pain. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening in its finality. Alice's heart pounded in her ears as she scrambled to her feet, rushing to Henry's side. The ground was cold and wet beneath her, the taste of fear sharp and metallic on her tongue. Henry knelt beside Lucas, his face etched with sorrow. I didn't want this, Lucas. I swear it. Lucas looked up at him, his breath ragged. You win, Taylor. You always did. Holding his side. You always did. Alice knelt beside them, her hands shaking as she pressed a handkerchief to Lucas's wound. Tears blurred her vision, hot and relentless. Help is coming, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if it was true. Lucas's eyes found hers, softer now, the anger gone. I'm sorry, Alice. I lost my way. She squeezed his hand, her own tears falling onto the grass. We all do sometimes, but it's never too late to find it again. The sun rose higher, bathing the prairie in golden light. The world felt changed, the air heavy with the cost of violence and the fragile hope of forgiveness. Henry wrapped his arms around Alice, holding her close as the silence settled once more. The reckoning was over, but its echoes would linger. Alice knew that nothing would ever be the same, but as she looked at Henry, his face streaked with tears, his arms strong and sure, she felt the first stirrings of peace. The prairie wind carried away the last of the gun smoke, and with it, the promise of a new beginning. Chapter 12. The promised spring had come to the prairie in a riot of color and scent, the land transformed by the gentle hand of rain and sun. Wildflowers painted the fields in a variety of beautiful colors, their petals trembling in the soft breeze. The sky arched overhead, endless and impossibly blue, dotted with drifting clouds that cast slow-moving shadows across the sea of new grass. The air was sweet, alive with the hum of bees and the distant song of a meadowlarks and many different kind of birds, and every breath Alice drew seemed to fill her with hope. She walked hand in hand with Henry, their fingers entwined, their steps unhurried as they wandered through the tall grass. The warmth of his palm against hers was a quiet reassurance, a promise made not with words, but with every gentle squeeze, every shared glance. The world felt new, as if the land itself had been reborn, and Alice's heart began to beat with a joy so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. They paused at the crest of a low hill, the town of Willow Creek a distant cluster of rooftops behind them, the prairie stretching wide and wild in every direction. Alice turned to Henry, her hair loose and shining in the sunlight, her face blushing with happiness. She could taste the sweetness of honey on her lips, the memory of his kiss lingering there, a taste that was all hope and promise, as bright and golden as the morning. Henry looked at her, his eyes alight with something she had never seen before, an openness, a vulnerability, a love that was as steady and enduring as the day was long. He reached up, his hand touching her face softly, his touch gentle and reverent. Holding her chin in his hand, said, I used to think I'd never find a place to belong, he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. But then you came here, Alice. You changed everything. You made this place a home. For me. Alice smiled, her heart swelling. I used to be afraid of the future, afraid of being alone, of never finding my place. But with you, Henry, I feel like I can face anything. The world doesn't seem so big and wild anymore, not when I have you by my side." He drew her close, his arms strong and sure around her waist. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, the sound grounding her in this moment, in this life they were building together. The scent of new grass and wildflowers wrapped around them, the air warm and soft. Henry pressed a kiss to her forehead, his lips lingering. "Will you marry me, Alice? Whatever comes, I promise I'll be here. I'll stand by you through every storm and every spring. I'll love you for as long as this prairie blooms." Tears shimmered in Alice's eyes, but they were tears of happiness, of relief, of a hope finally realized. She lifted her face to his, her lips finding his in a kiss that was so gentle and deep, filled with sunlight and the promise of forever. They stood together, the prairie stretching out as wide as they could see before them, wide and wild and full of possibility. The past, the pain, the fear, the loneliness, all had faded into a memory, replaced by something stronger, something enduring. This overpowering thing called love that grew between them. The future was theirs, as boundless as the sky, as bright as the wildflowers at their feet. Hand in hand, Alice and Henry walked on, their laughter rising on the breeze, their hearts light and unburdened. The land welcomed them, the promise of spring and love and new beginnings blooming all around. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Alice knew that she was home, truly, finally, and forever. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on more captivating tales. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and God bless. See you in the next video.